tonight with an extremely interesting topic. We have Professor Shiela Reaves, who's a professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies here in the Department of Life Science Communication, and an affiliate faculty member of American Indian Study. A number of you may have taken her classes. She specializes in visual communication and is interested in how neuroscience supports interdisciplinary theories of visual imagery used in science communication and visual messages. She is a member of two steering committees that represent vision science and that really bring people from different disciplines as the core of what we do in LSC. With the Wisconsin-Madison McPherson Eye Research Institute, a lot of biologists there, and the whole Center for Science and Technology Studies, a lot of sociologists more, and philosophy of science there. She serves on the editorial board of Visual Communication Quarterly, so definitely in her area of research, and we're really excited to have her with us here. So please join me in welcoming Shiela Reaves.
I'm going to tell you my background, but I think before I do that, I'm going to tell you what are the things that are foundational to a talk like this. The first one is Alan Pavio, who in the 20th century offered dual coding theories. Anyone heard of that? It's that notion of pictorial picture-image superiority, and that if we have a picture paired with good, appropriate wording, our memory increases. That's amazing when you think about that. And my background, I spent 10 years in photojournalism. So anything that talked about pictures were important. I always keyed in on that. And Pavio is so foundational to anyone who studies the visual brain. And the visual brain, as you know, is a metaphor. It's really the visual system, what neuroscientists talk about. But I think as a metaphor, the visual brain covers an awful lot that I enjoy. What I'm really interested in is what, in many ways, photojournalists always talked about in terms of finding the picture before it actually even happens. So you anticipate. It's a lot like a news reporter anticipating where to be, and they take in all of the cues that they have at a scene. Maybe it's a spot news scene, and they want to go and see the person ahead of time. Photojournalists have to do that with practically every photo that they make, is that they have to predict. And so this notion of the very first early processing of photography is a natural interest of mine, just because of that anticipation. We can't help ourselves with this early, low-level processing. Low-level does not mean unimportant. It just means that it's the first, and it's before thinking. Now let that sink in. Low-level is before cognition. So our thinking brains doesn't really have an impact on it. That's why optical illusions work. And then this notion of the visual brain comparing differences all the time, whether it be verbal, which we won't really talk about now, but when you're looking at things and someone says this and someone says that, and you see the difference, your brain is kind of wired for that. But I'm visually interested in the visual contrast that. And the notion of craving contrast. And when we talk about contrast, for those of you who are in graphic design or you've taken graphic design courses, please feel very comfortable with this. When we're talking about contrast, it's dark against middle gray against white, or dark against white. That's contrast. And we're really good at it. How many, I'm just curious, how many of you say, well, yeah, I enjoy contrast? How many of you enjoy looking at visual contrast? Okay, good. And you go into a museum, you see works of art, they are so good at visual contrast. But even if it's kind of a new term for you, you're good at it. Okay. So here's part of my photojournalism career. I was part of the generation of women that went into photography, scooped them in, didn't feel all that comfortable all the time, but could prove that yes, we could shoot sports and we could go to fires and we wouldn't screw it up, that kind of thing. But when the 1990s rolled around, which President Bush called the decade of the brain, I realized that instead of asking what makes a good picture, I could ask a different question. What attracts the visual brain? And so some of these questions that I was asking about photography actually were pre-questions about the visual brain. Why was I attracted to certain things? And just as a short answer, contrast was a big issue. And I always thought, why are you so interested in contrast? You just must be a little weird, because not everyone is. Okay, so one of the early forays into science communication that I appreciated was Giulio Ottino in Nature, who talked about how visual information is not decoration. And it was like music to my ears, because that's what you hear when you talk about visual communication in the media, which is where I came from. We have two cover stories here. These are carbon atoms in a nanotube. Don't ask me to explain it. These are two molecules. And Ottino was outraged, okay? And this is what he said, which is a good thing. It's good to have strong opinions when it comes to people violating visual things, because visual information is important. It helps form memory, okay? A sensible first rule would be that pictures must not be divorced from science and scientific plausibility. Images should not conflict with or violate known physics. Okay, so when we visualize science, we can violate the science underlying this cool image. It takes a lot, bless you, it takes a lot of expertise to be able to produce good scientific illustrations. And so when you find someone like Adam Steinberg here at the university, Art for Science, you stay close to him, because he can take an Excel spreadsheet and he can turn it into a magazine cover. There aren't that many that can do that. Anna Scope on this campus, same kind of, she's a genetics professor, and she can talk the language of visual arts. They're a rare combination. Okay, so, but let's go back to things that you may have known. How many of you know about the nanolouse? Around the turn of the millennium on that. It won awards, okay? Science Visions Award of 2002, and then it turned into this kind of mini nightmare, because it was just a visualization. They were just trying to get an idea of what could a nanolouse look like. But the problem was the public believed it, and it was like, ooh, I don't want nanotechnology and these little things going into my blood cells. And the image looks so real that it's easy to imagine a viewer being fooled into believing it's already been built. And again, Ottino was one that was, as a scientist, he had the full credentials to be outraged about it. And he pointed out to at the time, Michael Crichton's movie on Prey. It's the thing is, and you know this for those of you who study risk communication, it's pretty easy to scare the public. Okay, so the nanolouse. Let's return to the beginning of vision science. And the beginning of vision science began with Hubble and Wiesel. In the 1960s, they won the Nobel Prize in 1981 in medicine. And they looked and proved that there were particular individual neurons that would activate, light up, for a particular orientation of a line. This took a huge amount. We're not talking fMRIs being around there. We're talking about old-fashioned technology and animal experiments. But there would be neurons that only activated with the horizontal line. Other lines were clearly vertical. And to a lesser extent, you had neurons that would activate to a diagonal line. Okay, and this was lines of orientation, very, very important, very basic, and we'll talk about that later. Samir Zeki, did anyone read Inner Vision? Because it was one of those sleeper cult books in academia, and in 1999, I think they reissued it, but for a while there, it was only in the UK. And in 2001 in AAAS, you had him claiming the fact that, yes, he did coin the term neuroaesthetics. And that's basically the realization that as you were looking and finding out more and more about these neurons, you realized that artists had intuited these rules. The great masters had intuited these rules for a long time, and that was what Inner Vision was about. Bless you. So neuroaesthetics. Okay, aesthetics is the hunt for beauty. But, you know, being interesting is probably the greater field. And then you had, after Samir Zeki, you had a host of wonderful neuroscientists coming together to figure out, what does this look like, what can we do, how can we prove it, and you have a slew of excellent books. Okay, and then probably our first textbook came out in 2015 out of Oxford University. And I think it was still probably one of the best. And so if you're interested in this field, these would be books to look for. Okay, are there any questions so far? So it's an emerging field. Okay. Let's go back to what we already know about our brain, and this notion of low-level processing, the early baseline processing of our brains. And it's the amygdala, which is the emotional seat of the brain. And its sole question, as Jill Bolte-Taylor talked about, she was a neuroscientist out of Harvard who had a stroke and lost the part of the left side of her brain, and until she recovered her faculties, moved to Indiana and began teaching again, she lived in a right brain world. And she said, when she visited the UW, a beautiful line, which is, this is the first question that the brain asks, am I safe? Okay. And you get an idea that it's a pretty good answer. I mean, a question to ask. Okay, because that's what our visual brain is doing, is, okay, where are we? So what I would do as a challenge to you is the next time you're in an unfamiliar place, kind of step outside yourself and watch yourself looking at this new territory. If next time you're in a really dark, kind of creepy alley, look around. What do you do? What's your behavior like? Because you're really depending on that visual brain. Get an idea. Do you trust your visual brain? Do you trust the fact that it's so pre-conscious that, am I safe? And it goes on so quickly that you're not even aware of it. If you walk into your a new classroom, which you've been doing for the last week or two, you're kind of looking around to see if you feel safe, and you will be feeling safer and safer as the semester goes on. Okay, but this is what our visual brain is designed to do: defeat camouflage. Okay, 70% of our sensory cells are to the visual brain. So think about that: eating, touch, smell. Those are the 30% of the other sensory cells that get to split this up. We are such visual creatures, and so it would be, I think that we're becoming more of a visual society, especially with digital media. But I want us to be an articulate visual society too. Here we have some camouflage. You may have seen some of them. This is Lou Bolin out of China, who's a delightful artist. If you want to Google Lou Bolin, he's just fabulous, because just like the artists of old, he is intuiting some of the basic brain rules of good seeing, or easy seeing, easy processing of the brain. Okay? This preconscious brain, and we're talking about before 300 milliseconds, we're talking about lines, which Hubble and Weasel talked about, luminance contrast, which we've talked about, and this notion of face seeking. Whether you're aware of it or not, you're always kind of looking around for faces, and you see them even when they're not real. Why? Because our ancestors, it behooved them to be able to see faces, because even if they were false, that's fine. Brain doesn't care if it's a false face, but you don't want to miss a face that wants to eat you. Okay. And you see this in, I think this is about 30,000 BC. You see these cave artists. Look at the lines here around the faces, the fact that they're faces. We had color and we had depth cues. They were already working at them. But this notion of contrast and lines was apparent to cave artists early on. We just didn't really kind of know what they meant. Picasso is supposed to have said, after visiting one of the cave arts in Europe, we have learned nothing. And it's something to think about. Okay. So every once in a while you'll run into artist Beth Doolittle. There are about 15 faces here, and you have to defeat camouflage. And all you have to know is there are faces. Now people are like looking forward and they can see the faces. Now I didn't ask you to do that. I just said there are 15 faces. Okay. Every once in a while I'll find a new face, and the birch tree over here. Anyone see a face? Yeah. That took me years to find. Okay, I was looking over here, down there, and in the, that sort of thing. But we can see them. We're wired for that. That's early processing. Okay, which makes sense that the media, and this is part of my photojournalism career, the media has a lot of faces. Okay, selfies is about your face with another face. We're wired for that. And we're kind of wired for a bias toward the center. We put the faces in the center of whatever canvas it is that we're looking at. Okay, scientists don't know why, but we do. We have that. So it makes sense that one of the first or early photos for visualizing science is to use a face. Okay, tell the story of famous scientists. I mean, we're wired for that. So what I'm talking about, especially in my 350 class, working with the visual brain for communicating to audiences. Okay. So let's look a little bit on here. Our brain cells are difference detectors. That's an important thing. If you're going to remember one thing from this talk, remember that your brain cells are difference detectors, verbally and conceptually, but visually. We're good at seeing differences. If you help us make differences, if you help us not offer camouflage instead. The brain hates camouflage. It fools them all the time. Makes sense. That's why the military adopts that. And the fact that pictures and words together are so much more powerful than alone. And if you edit them well together, well-edited photos with well-edited words, and put that together, that's editing at a very high level. And you can do that anywhere, as long as you know that it's important. Captions are an entry point to any image, scientific or not. I'm going to show a few things, primarily in many ways from Colin Ware, who is a computer scientist who wrote a textbook. And I loved it because he understood that computer scientists can know how to program, but are they going to do it well? Are they going to do it so that it works with, I'm sure he doesn't call it the visual brain, but he understands in terms of visual perception. And a glance is faster than verbal processing. So when you're walking around the campus and you're looking both ways, like your mama told you, look both ways, that glance is faster than saying, oh, is there a truck coming down this road? You don't say that, you just glance. It's faster than words. Yes, I'm safe, we can walk now. Scientists will study this glance. They call it a gist, it's a scene. It's very patterns of patterns, very rough and coarse, but it's 1/10 of a second, and it's unconscious. It's pre-conscious. Okay? That's a good thing to know about. So that 2 seconds is a long time in visual thinking. Okay? When you really, really appreciate visual images, how many of you will sometimes feel guilty going through a museum and you're kind of walking fast? You're looking around, you're like, nope, 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 nope. And there's enough laughter that you recognize that. Well, now the shame can end. 2 seconds is a long time in visual processing. Okay, visual thinking. You can tell pretty quickly, actually in 2/3 of a second, whether you like something or not, whether you want to hang around or not. Okay, so for the scientists I have released you, art historians will disagree forever with that statement. Another thing, luminance contrast, also again, you can't turn it off. It's low-level processing that the brain uses this. And the notion of color contrast, this is again design and it is visual appreciation at a higher level. The fact that you're not bamboozled by color, you know, blue. You know it's dark blue or light blue, because your visual brain's using it. It's just pre-conscious and pre-verbal, so it's not saying, don't you want to know this is light and dark blue? But we get the contrast. So if you make it conscious that color contrast is important, you will have just jumped over a hurdle in terms of standing out as a visual editor or as a visual producer of images, because you're working with the visual brain. Okay, so let me show you. Here's the muffin tin drawing. How many of you have seen this before who haven't taken my 350 class? And what's going to happen?
Your perception, you can get your perception to flip, basically.
Yes, the perception switches. We have some dints. This, by the way, was drawn in the 18th century by David Rittenhouse, who was an American astronomer. We turn it upside down. That's all I did was flip it. And so we now have bumps and only one dent. Okay? Why? Well, first of all, let's talk about how contrast, I love this. This is Margaret Livingston, Vision and Art. If you're interested in the biology of art, get this book. She's just marvelous. She's at Harvard. Contrast alone is enough to give a vivid sensation of three-dimensionality. So if you add color to that, that's even more powerful, but it hinges on the contrast of the black and white or the contrast of the colors. Artists learn this, okay? Art schools teach this. And scientists, unless you're an artist, you never really, there's a reason for you to walk across this very powerful part of the visual brain. So let's look at David MacDonald, and his brain rule is that light falls from above. Why? What light are we talking about? The sun. Okay. And shadows are going to form underneath. And so this could be a really annoying picture to you. You realize the artist is playing with your brain rules. Okay, it's not the way it should be, and you flip back and forth, and some of you are getting more and more annoyed. I usually do. Or some of you might like it. I mean, the thing about the visual brain is that it's shaped by culture and autobiography. So the fact that we might be using the same processes, we have different opinions about them. And so if you like this, you can call it a neurocharm, which came from Frederick Turner in 1996 in the Journal of Social and Evolutionary Science. And it was an essay that really had a lot of influence in the art world, because he was an artist, and he actually expanded it more than just the visual brain. But a neurocharm. Okay, and when you think about it, all of the masters of art that we still keep and hang in rooms all around the planet, museums, they figured out how to charm our brains. Okay? So now with this contrast, with this notion of lines, I could go back to my work and I could kind of get an idea of why I was attracted to that. And that acuity of outside edges. Okay, outside edges is what the brain, the pre-verbal brain is trying to do. It's not looking at someone's face, it's looking at their head. It's not looking at whether their smile is sinister or not. It's looking where they're at and placing them in a location. But contrast is going to increase those lines, that acuity, that sharpness. Okay? So I was a contrast geek and didn't know it. But it's important, and it's not going to change. This is our brain. It's just that culture and autobiography will tell us if it's important or not, and you can make that decision yourself. Okay, let's apply some of these rules to science. In what you have, you look at the contrast. Okay, this is the cosmic level. This is the nanotechnology level. The nano level is about 2.5 nanometers. You have an award-winning science cover, but look at the contrast. Before I add the color, look at the contrast. You have dark and grays and a little bit of whites. So it's good contrast. Then if we add the color, we can see the lights and the yellows and the black. But it's that kind of neural charm, of contrast, that the low-level processing brain is seeing easily on that. So scientists will learn technology maybe through metaphors, because this is dark matter, invisible dark matter, which is not poppy orange, California poppy orange. Or they'll use technology to create, in this case, the famous nanotoilet, which is 2.5 nanometers. And think about it, if you've got thick hair, you're lucky enough to have that thick hair, your strand of your hair is 100,000 nanometers. Whereas if you have fine little hair like mine, it's 50,000. Okay? The thing is that just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you can use all this cool Photoshop technology without someone raising questions like me. In that adding blue to the nano image, and this is a beautiful image, but the nano scientists understand this, but does the public understand that this color, the wavelength is 380 to 495 nanometers. So it's longer than the image. It's wider and bigger than the image. That is kind of the stuff that makes your head hurt, right? Okay, so science is amazing. And so I go back to the The vision scientists like Margaret Livingston, who is able to show their neuroscientific studies, but through an artist's lens. And vision and art, you know, she talks about what I've been talking about. I mean, she shows the science behind that. That we have in this sort of processing of visual images, we have this pre-conscious aware system. It's called the dorsal stream. And when an image is in this, I'm blanking on the brain part. What's? Yeah, okay, it's top of the brain, parietal lobe. When it's at the top, that's where it's conscious. But there's been a lot of activity before you're conscious. That's the 300 milliseconds where low-level processing is coming in. When you get to the what system, when you're identifying this, okay, that's after 300 milliseconds. So we're talking about, you know, a second chopped up into 1,000 pieces. And at 300 milliseconds, that's where your memory begins. So this stuff before, this is your temporal lobe and this is your what pathway, okay? Where the where system or the dorsal stream is talking about is figure ground segregation, which you're trying to get a face out of the background, that defeats camouflage. Depth and motion and spatial, which is placing that in some kind of a field. It's colorblind, even though it uses dark and light of a color that it sees. It's fast. High contrast sensitivity. Those are the first 300 milliseconds. And then when memory starts to begin, that's the what system. That's recognizing the faces, okay? If you have a face that you love, that's your amygdala processing and going, oh, it's my nephew, I love him. Okay? If it is a picture of a politician, that's your thinking brain going, okay, this is a congressman, yeah, I have problems with him, you know, that kind of thing. So our visual system is throughout parts of our brain for very particular and important areas. But what I love is this notion of judging beauty or making a decision, it's a moral decision, that's between 400 and 600 milliseconds. So you can go through your museum and you can be walking through, no, oh, I want to go there. Okay, very quickly. It's one neuroscientist talked about, it's almost like you open your eyes and you're thinking. It just sometimes doesn't have words to it. You are making judgments about what's of interest to you. Okay. So we look at a photo like this and we know it's not a tragedy. We know immediately it's not a tragedy. It's clever, it's fun. It's called occlusion in terms of depth perception, and we get it very quickly. Okay? The brain assumes 3 dimensions. So it doesn't have to see the entire part for it to assume that there is a part of the body that it can't see. Occlusion is the most universal depth cue, and depth can be very cultural. Visual anthropologists have talked about how culture trains our brain. Well, it really trains our brain in terms of depth cues. People that live in the forest, and that's all they've had to create for themselves in terms of judging distance. You get out of that forest and you're on a savanna and they don't have the cues. They have the potential to develop the cues. But depth perception is something that a child starts to learn. That's why your coloring books, when you first start coloring, are so simple. Okay, there's no need for depth cues, and they're usually about faces. Okay, let's go to some more things about using optical illusions to prove things that your brain is doing. So what I'd like to do is have you try to notice what your eyes are doing. Okay. Just notice what your eyes might be doing. And you can just look at one if you want. What are your eyes doing? What are your eyes doing with this? The most annoying optical illusion ever. Try to look at it without figuring it out. Okay. Try to look at it, you know. It's the devil's fork. We don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. And we're trying to solve the problem, and we can't. Okay? You can't. It's just too annoying. But look at it without doing that. Just stop, stop, stop. Don't do it. You're cheating. Okay? This is early processing. Okay? Low-level processing. You know that this is a trick. You know that that's an impossible object, but yet you still try to fix it. You're following the lines against your will. This is huge to know. It's just as important as luminance contrast, is knowing that we follow lines against our will, because lines create shapes and they create messages. And that's why I love that low-level processing here. Okay? The ambiguity of depth, the brain hates it. So if you're getting really annoyed by this and like, Sheila, I'm ready to move on, it's because your brain is saying, this is just ridiculous. Okay? Okay. But here's the line, here's the rule that we can extract from that. We follow lines to their conclusion. Okay? You see a line and you follow it. So don't take my word for it. Start walking around, start looking at how you follow lines. Okay? Let's look at it, let's start to get into visualizing data on here. We're following our lines, even when they're making mistakes and not doing what's called zero basing, which gives you a sense of the context. So this is looking like, oh my God, we're about to die. And this one's like, well, we're falling, but it's not that bad. Okay? It's the same data. And so zero basing is very important for people who are visualizing data and numbers. Another thing is a notion, and this is a tick mark, and if you have them equal, okay, so width and depth is the same length, you have probably kind of a boring graph, but it's accurate. Whereas if you want to add some drama with the same data, then make the tick marks half the width or widen them out. So it's like, don't worry, you're not going to lose everything, just hang tight. Okay, so this is Chicken Little with the skies falling. This is don't worry, it'll be okay, but it's all the same data. And so visually, we follow the lines and we kind of don't, you need to think about the fact of how has the computer scientist or the graphic artist put together these graphs. Because we tend to accept them, even when they're actually biased or inaccurate. We follow lines. That's what we do. So here's another thing that we try to do. Try to watch yourself watching. Now you don't have to worry about this. This is a tree map, which is kind of like a bar chart, which is just comparing simple things. Tree maps are comparing more, but we're talking about pretty simple comparisons. Okay? So we're at the lunch hour. What's your eye doing? Just watch yourself watching. Are you watching them and saying these are two burgers? Or are you kind of noticing one is bigger? And can you look at those without noticing that one is bigger? If it's close enough, okay, and this is a big proximity we need. If it's close enough, we will compare differences and we can't help it. Okay, the size differences, greater differences or greater attention. This comes out of Stephen Koslin, who's a cognitive psychologist out of Harvard in the 1990s. Did a lot of really good brain studying. And so as a communicator of science or your particular field, you can look at this as a neural charm. Because again, if it's close enough, you can do wonderful things that activate. They're called attention magnets. They activate our interest. Okay, just by knowing how the visual brain is working. So these are wonderful ways to show size. Of course, you have to be aware of the country. Okay, so in the U.S., most of us are I didn't know Alaska was that big. Okay, Africa. How big is Africa? Well, you can put the U.S., China, and India. And you still have room. Okay, we compare sizes if we have enough proximity, if it's close enough, and it can be a neural charm because we compare size differences and we compare differences. Okay, the brain does that at a low level. So I want to thank Dominique for this. This was the flowingdata.com by Nathan Yao, and he gives a lot of good points. First of all, these are 15 countries. 15 years, life expectancy at birth is the numbers they're talking about. It's from the World Health Organization. And he says, like everyone, if you talk to anyone who's doing visualizing science, or data, start with your audience. That's where you begin. And if you're an undergrad or have anything to do with LSC, any course at any time, you're going to hear, start with your audience. Okay, because that's what communicators do. They know who are we trying to communicate to. But what I like about him is he says, start with the basics. So we have bar charts and line charts, and here's a line chart. Okay, so it's bar charts across time, basically, whereas bar charts are just going to be humming around and you notice the differences there. What I'd like to do is add a few, and you can go to flowingdata.com and Google 25 data set 25 ways if you want to see this. All these do is just grow on here. But if the brain craves contrast, then this spaghetti, this line, it does look like, you know, a spaghetti here. Probably not the best way to do your data. If size differences are important, then this that have little tiny circles in little tiny, their own separate little boxes, and then their boxes are stacked together, it's hard to compare the differences. Okay, so I would say that this wouldn't be one that you would choose. Luminance contrast, important to all of them, so maybe this might be a little hard to see. But something as maybe, you know, not the most glamorous, but it's the easiest to see in terms of 15 countries' life expectancies over 15 years. And that's what you want. You want to use these graphics that work with the visual brain, I think is our next way of doing good visualizing of data. It's work with the brain. And so what I'd like to do, for those of you who might be interested, is Jonathan Schwabish did an Economist Guide to Visualizing Data. And I went to a journalist workshop a couple of years ago, and who was on the speakerphone giving the workshop? Jonathan Schwabish. So he's very highly regarded in journalism circles, economic circles. He worked for the government for huge data sets. And this is what he's saying. He's saying basically, yes, you can do bar charts like this, and yes, they're difference detectors, but you can accomplish it with contrast too. Okay? It's just go with what's easier for the brain. That's what he would recommend. He doesn't talk about luminance contrast. I'm talking about it. Okay? But he's using it. He doesn't talk about color. Well, he does talk about color contrast. He does. He just doesn't say you can't turn it off. So here we have a data set. He calls it, it's a scatter plot. He's calling it a clutter plot. Okay? And he's looking and he's got all, you know, big opinions, which is, you know, you respect. And instead, if you can see this, we have a black line, we have gray circles, and then we have just the black dots from the countries that this graph is trying to show, the differences. So you have contrast. You have the black, the darkest point being what's important. You have the gray of the context of all of the other data. Okay, and then you have the white. That's working well. Okay, and it doesn't take a genius. You just need to be told that this is how the visual brain works. So work with contrast. Here's the same thing. He said we've got color. We've got color. He calls this a spaghetti chart up here, and then he revises it. And look what he's doing. He's just adding luminance contrast. Black is the important one, and you know it. The gray is the context, and you can see it if you're interested. And then we have a nice, clean white background. That's a neural charm for the brain. Easy to process quickly. Okay. And another thing, and a lot of you have used this technology that sizes information. It's always been information, but now it's more clever with our digital technology, and brain compares differences. We can't turn that off. So here we have Wordle. This was invented by Jonathan Feinberg in 2008, and he was like in his mid-20s, and everyone was so jealous of him. I mean, he's brilliant. He's getting all these awards, and he's getting job offers because he could operationalize the fact that size is information. And it's a wonderful neural charm. You can take the art. David McCandless is another visualizing data artist, And you can look at it and you can see if our brain cells are difference detectors, we have differences in location, top and bottom, big versus small, and we know that big has more, and more must be special category than small. We don't have to be told that. Length and width, tall and narrow, this is easy to process with the visual brain. Okay? And so you can go through great graphics, and just by applying following the lines, the difference detections, you can have more confidence, for one. Okay. Let's end with one of these. This comes from Schwabish and, oh no, I'm sorry, Science Communication, Wells and Murray. Is that? Okay. And they had a problem with this graphic because it's talking about the polarization of politics, particularly Congress. And you know, this is a pretty, not violent, but I mean, this is duking it out, you know, and they wanted to slow it down just a bit. So we're using the same data set, and this is the exciting times that we live in that we have computers that can create this. So this is the same data set. It's a little like Nathan Yau's earlier, and you see the different ways you can do the same data set to try to give you a sense of what's happening. And what they chose was this graphic, in terms that it's close enough on that, but you can see a little bit more than here. That just kind of looks like a ball of yarn on that. And this is pretty much like that, where they're kind of amoebas eating the other ones. So I think in terms of visualizing, we have the contrast, we're following the lines, but we have room to breathe. So what I'd like to leave you with are some of these principles that we've had, because I've been throwing a lot at you. And so let's close with this. The first one is that neuroaesthetics is emerging out of neuroscientists, and I believe it's going to be a field that continues to become sophisticated because they're interested in what artists have already intuited. Again, we're talking the master artists. Okay. And some brain rules that we have. Our brain cells are difference detectors from Hubble and Weasel. That luminance contrast helps defeat camouflage, and that's what your brain wants to do to keep you safe, is defeat camouflage. That face seeking is hardwired. Okay, so next time you see a face looking at the wood, or looking in a bush, or looking up at the clouds, congratulate yourself, okay? You are understanding the hardwired brain. That lines, particularly outside edges, is what the brain uses for form, and that's why contrast is so good, black against white. And that the brain follows lines to its conclusion. We kind of are like a string just following it, like little ducklings or something like that. It's not something that we can think about, we just do it because it's low-level processing. And that's beyond our cognition. That attention magnets, the fact that these low-level visual processing, you can't turn it off, use it to your advantage in terms of science communication. Okay, that would be the one thing that I would, that's our consciousness, it's a pre-consciousness that's very, very important. And then to close on this, we have more neuroaesthetics. If you go to Wimmer 2 over at the medical school and go up to the 9th floor during the day, there's a visual perception as a tool gallery and some museum. One of my colleagues is in chemistry, and this is his personal art collection. And this whole notion that visual perception as a tool is something that you see in art all the time. So you can take this lecture and you can say, oh, well, yeah, I know that. Well, yeah. That kind of thing. And it's going on through May. It just opened. And then I have an online course that we approved to be taught again, May through July, 5 weeks. It has a graduate component, and you'll learn more about this, and you'll, as a graduate student, read some of the neuroaesthetics that I have been talking about. So with that, thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions.
Yes.
So you were saying that something like a bar chart or a line graph, it's a very basic thing. And when I look at that, it's very intuitive. But to what extent is it really, so I mean, because I've learned to read bar graphs and
Yeah.
it has those lines of that contrast, but if you were to give something, I don't know if there's research on this, if you gave like a small child a bar graph, could they figure out what it was trying to say?
That's really interesting. I don't know the answer to that. That's a study you could create. I don't know of any study of children being given any kind of charts and graphs. It tends to be the nerds among us. Yes.
Can I add something?
Yes,
We did
please
some
do.
visual com with nuclear energy, and I mean there is a graph literacy. You know how you have numeracy literacy and so on. So you have some people that are more inclined to understand that kind of representation versus
Yes.
others.
Yes.
However, that depends on the age level, and you have to teach your child to interpret that with, even if they follow the line, they do not know that the line represents
Right.
a logical, whatever.
Data.
Data.
Yeah. Also, too, is especially for depth, children, they can be 14 years old before they really understand
Exactly.
relative size, and which is size gets smaller in the distance. And then entire cultures can say, oh, relative size, that's not important.
Yeah.
So really, there's a lot of the visual brain that culture and age are creating.
Exactly.
So good question. Any other hard questions we can have? I want to talk to our neuroscientist. How was this? Did it vibe with what you talk about in terms of neurobiology?
Definitely, and one of the things I thought was interesting was similarities with the auditory system as far as figure ground separation and there being basic features of a stimulus that you automatically pitch is something that you quickly use to separate if you've got a bunch of people talking at the same time. There is no space in your auditory system, it's literally just all overlapping, so you have to use.
Right, so there are parallels with auditory systems.
Yes.
Yeah. Hannah, anything from your neurobiology? Did anything resonate? Oh yeah, this is familiar.
A lot of it resonated. The thing that occurred to me more than neurobiology stuff is that I have some experience with there's a type of Appalachian style of singing that, oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of right now.
Shape note?
Yes, shape note, thank you. Shape note singing, where they've incorporated other types of visuals, specifically notes in different shapes, and they've changed the scale of the notes, and it's meant to help teach people who aren't formally trained, and it's a very visually different experience.
Yeah.
Hard for people who know how to read music already to change their mindset, but it strikes me as an example of how you can change the visual in order to make it more intuitive.
And that goes back to Pavio just a bit, although he didn't study auditory, but in terms of visual information with verbal meaning, you put that together, and you have that. Any other questions? So for the rest of...
a very fundamental question.
Yes.
A little bit embarrassed.
No, there are no fun, no.
You mentioned a lot visual brain, but what is the rest of the brain?
Oh, the rest of the brain is thinking brain.
Okay,
so yes, cognitive brain. The thinking brain starts at 300 milliseconds. Okay, we're conscious, our memory's starting, that kind of thing. We're judging things between 400 and 600, so we're already being opinionated in under a second. I love that. And so have confidence in yourself. You might be wrong, but test it, okay? And
but I'm just confused
so the frontal part is thinking, and that's what makes us different. That's what makes us storytellers. The temporal part and the frontal part, which is the thinking brain.
Yeah, but you mentioned, do we trust our visual brain? But isn't that...
No, go ahead.
Oh, isn't that unconditional trust?
Yeah, I mean, if it's pre-verbal, if it's 300 milliseconds, it's not even conscious, we are trusting it. We are saying, don't go there, I'm going over here. I don't know why, but I'm going over here. That's trusting our brain. Okay, yeah. Well, don't leave too much. So it's a fascinating field, and I'm only staying within my part. I'm very conservative. I'm not on the outside, where you guys would be if you're testing things. I want to stay with core principles, and that's what I've done. So yes, I've given you a really lopsided, unfair picture of the brain.
No, this was great. Thank you so much, Sheila.
Okay.